The dust swirled around Sarah McKenna's worn leather boots as she stood outside Hartley's general store, clutching a crumpled list in her trembling hands. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Cedar Ridge's main street, but the heat she felt came more from the hostile stares than the Texas sky. "Cursed," Mrs. Henderson had whispered loud enough for half the town to hear. "That girl brings nothing but trouble wherever she goes." Sarah's green eyes, inherited from her Irish father, scanned the handwritten list her mother had given her that morning. Flour, salt, coffee beans, simple necessities that had become complicated ever since she'd spoken up against Sheriff Dalton 3 weeks ago. The memory still burned in her chest like a brand. It had been a Tuesday morning when she'd witnessed Dalton and his deputies dragging a young Comanche man through the street, his hands bound, blood trickling from a split lip. The man hadn't resisted, hadn't fought back, but Dalton had struck him anyway with the butt of his rifle. "Stop!" Sarah had called out, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet street. "Can't you see he's not fighting you?" The sheriff had turned, his cold grey eyes finding her among the small crowd that had gathered. "Miss McKenna," he'd said, his voice dripping with false courtesy, "I'd suggest you mind your own business. This savage was caught stealing cattle from the Morrison Ranch." "Then take him to jail," Sarah had replied, her heart hammering against her ribs. "There's no need for brutality." The murmur that had rippled through the crowd wasn't one of agreement. She'd seen the looks, disapproval, shock, even disgust. In that moment she'd felt the invisible threads that connected her to her community begin to fray. Now, 3 weeks later, those threads had snapped entirely. "We don't serve your kind here," came a gravelly voice from behind her. Sarah turned to see Tom Hartley standing in his store's doorway, his massive frame blocking the entrance. His usually jovial face was set in hard lines, his arms crossed over his barrel chest. "My kind?" Sarah's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "Troublemakers, Injun lovers." He spat into the dust at her feet. "Find somewhere else to spend your money." The words hit her like physical blows. She'd known Tom Hartley since she was 7 years old. He'd given her peppermint sticks when her father brought her to town, had taught her to count change when she was old enough to run errands for her mother. "Tom, please," she whispered. "It's just supplies for my family." "Your family should have taught you better." His eyes were as cold as winter stones. "Should have taught you loyalty to your own people instead of sympathizing with savages." Sarah felt tears threatening, but she forced them down. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Not here. Not in front of half the town that had gathered to watch her humiliation. "I was taught to show compassion to all God's creatures," she said, lifting her chin despite the tremor in her voice. "I was taught that cruelty is wrong no matter who it's directed toward." "God's creatures," Hartley laughed bitterly. "Those animals ain't God's creatures, girl. They're devils in human skin, and anyone who can't see that is either blind or cursed." There it was again. That word. Cursed. It followed her everywhere now. Whispered in doorways, muttered behind hands, spoken with the kind of conviction usually reserved for biblical truths. Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her, people who had been neighbors, friends, fellow churchgoers. Mrs. Patterson, who had taught her to embroider. Young Billy Morrison, who used to pull her braids during Sunday service. Even Reverend Walsh stood at the edge of the crowd, his face carefully neutral, but his silence speaking volumes. "Then I suppose I'll have to find another way," Sarah said quietly, folding the list and tucking it into her apron pocket. As she turned to leave, she heard Mrs. Henderson's voice rise above the others. "Mark my words. That girl's brought a curse on this whole town. Nothing good will come of harboring someone who sides with the enemy." Sarah walked home along the dusty road that led to her family's small farm, the weight of isolation settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. The McKenna homestead sat on a slight rise about 2 miles from town, a modest 2-room cabin surrounded by a struggling vegetable garden and a small barn that housed their 3 chickens and aging milk cow. Her mother, Colleen, was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when Sarah approached. The older woman's face, weathered by years of frontier life but still beautiful, showed immediate concern when she saw her daughter's empty hands. "They wouldn't serve me," Sarah said simply. Colleen's face crumpled with a mixture of anger and sorrow. She crossed the yard quickly, pulling her daughter into a fierce embrace that smelled of lye soap and lavender. "I'm sorry, darling," she whispered into Sarah's auburn hair. "I'm so sorry this is happening to you. Are they right, Ma?" Sarah pulled back, searching her mother's face. Am I cursed? Am I bringing trouble to our family? Colleen cupped her daughter's face in her work-roughened hands. Listen to me, Sarah McKenna. You are not cursed. You are blessed with a conscience and a heart that sees beyond the color of a person's skin. Your grandmother would be proud of the woman you've become. Sarah's grandmother, Bridget O'Malley, had been the closest thing to a doctor Cedar Ridge had known before the current physician arrived. She delivered babies, set bones, and treated ailments with herbs and remedies brought from the old country. More importantly, she'd never turned anyone away. Not the Mexican laborers, not the former slaves who'd drifted through, not even the occasional Native American who'd sought her help. Grandmother never faced anything like this, Sarah said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Didn't she? Colleen smiled sadly. Child, your grandmother was driven out of 3 different towns before we settled here. People fear what they don't understand, and they punish those who show kindness to the wrong people. But she never stopped doing what she believed was right, and neither should you. That evening, as Sarah helped her mother prepare a meager dinner from their dwindling supplies, she found herself thinking about the young Comanche man she'd tried to help. She wondered if he was still alive, if Sheriff Dalton's version of justice had claimed another victim. The not knowing gnawed at her, adding another layer to her growing sense of powerlessness. As the sun set over the Texas plains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Sarah made a quiet promise to herself. Whatever came next, whatever price she had to pay, she wouldn't let fear and hatred change who she was. She wouldn't let them make her into someone her grandmother wouldn't recognize. She had no way of knowing that her test was already approaching, riding across the prairie under the cover of darkness, carrying a burden that would force her to choose between safety and conscience once again. Though to Mark Chapter 2, The Desperate Plea. 3 days later, Sarah was in the garden behind their cabin, pulling weeds from between the struggling tomato plants, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. She straightened, shading her eyes against the morning sun, and felt her breath catch in her throat. A lone rider was approaching their homestead, and even from a distance, she could see he was Comanche. He sat tall on his painted horse, his long black hair braided with what looked like strips of leather and small bones. As he drew closer, Sarah could make out the intricate beadwork on his shirt and the careful way he held himself, not the posture of someone seeking trouble, but of someone carrying an enormous burden. "Ma!" Sarah called, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and something else she couldn't quite name. "Someone's coming!" Colleen emerged from the cabin, drying her hands on her apron, and froze when she saw the approaching rider. In the 3 weeks since Sarah's confrontation with Sheriff Dalton, tensions between the town and the local Comanche bands had only grown worse. 2 more incidents had occurred: a missing horse that was blamed on raiders, and a barn fire that some claimed was retribution for increased military patrols. The rider stopped about 20 feet from their small porch, his dark eyes moving between mother and daughter with careful assessment. Sarah found herself studying his face, weathered by sun and wind, marked by what looked like old scars along his left cheek, but not cruel. There was something in his expression that reminded her of her father when he was worried about a sick animal. "I am Running Bear of the Penateka Comanche," he said, in heavily accented but clear English. "I seek the woman who spoke against the lawman's cruelty." Sarah's heart began to race. "That would be me," she said, stepping forward despite her mother's sharp intake of breath. Running Bear studied her for a long moment, and Sarah had the distinct impression she was being measured in some way she didn't understand. Finally, he spoke again. "My son is dying," he said simply, and the pain in those 4 words was so raw that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. "The medicine man has done all he can. The army doctor will not come to our camp. You are said to have knowledge of healing plants." Sarah glanced back at her mother, whose face had gone pale. They both understood what this meant. If word got back to town that they had helped a Comanche, especially now with tensions so high, it could mean more than just social ostracism. It could mean violence. "How old is your son?" Sarah asked quietly. 11 summers, Running Bear replied. "He burns with fever, and his breath comes in rattles. He cannot keep water down." The warrior's stoic expression cracked slightly. "He calls for his mother, but she died birthing his sister 2 winters past." Sarah felt something crack open in her chest. An 11-year-old boy sick and calling for his dead mother. The politics of it, the danger, the town's reaction. None of it seemed to matter in the face of that simple, devastating truth. "Sarah," her mother whispered urgently, Think about what you're doing. I am thinking, Ma. Sarah turned to face Running Bear fully. What are his symptoms exactly? Fever that will not break, coughing that brings blood, skin hot and dry, then wet with sweat. He cannot eat, can barely drink. Running Bear's voice remained steady, but his hands tightened on his horse's reins. He grows weaker with each passing day. Sarah's mind raced through everything her grandmother had taught her. Fever, bloody cough, difficulty keeping fluids down. It sounded like pneumonia, possibly complicated by dehydration. Dangerous, especially in a child, but not necessarily fatal if treated properly. I would need to see him, she said finally, and I would need to bring supplies. Sarah, no. Colleen stepped forward, her voice sharp with fear. You cannot go to a Comanche camp. Even if your intentions are good, if something happens to you there, Sheriff Dalton will use it as an excuse to... She couldn't finish the sentence. If something happens to the boy because I didn't help when I could have, Sarah replied softly, how will I live with myself? Running Bear watched this exchange with careful attention. When Sarah turned back to him, he spoke again. The woman speaks wisdom, he said, nodding toward Colleen. There is danger for you in this. My people are not all friendly to white settlers. Some have lost much to your soldiers, your diseases. They might not understand why you come. And your people? Sarah asked. Sheriff Dalton and the others in town, they've already decided I'm a traitor to my own kind. What's one more reason for them to hate me? She saw something change in Running Bear's expression, a flicker of what might have been respect. You would risk much for a child you do not know, he said. Your son, Sarah corrected gently. Not just any child. Your son. For the first time since he'd arrived, Running Bear's careful composure slipped entirely. Sarah saw the desperate father beneath the stoic warrior's exterior, and her decision crystallized completely. I'll come, she said, but I need time to gather what I'll need, and I want to come back here tonight. I won't abandon my mother to face questions alone. Running Bear nodded slowly. This is acceptable. But know this, if you come to our camp, you will be under my protection. No harm will come to you from my people, but I cannot protect you from the consequences among your own. I understand, Sarah said, though she wasn't sure she fully grasped what those consequences might be. Give me 2 hours to prepare, she continued. Meet me at the old oak tree by Willow Creek. Do you know it? I know it. As Running Bear turned his horse to leave, he paused and looked back at her. Why do you do this thing? Sarah considered the question, thinking of her grandmother's gentle hands treating anyone who needed healing, thinking of the young Comanche man she'd seen beaten in the street, thinking of an 11-year-old boy calling for his dead mother. Because it's right, she said simply. Running Bear studied her face for another long moment, then nodded once before riding away. As soon as he was out of sight, Colleen grabbed her daughter's arm. Sarah, please think about this. Once you do this thing, there's no taking it back. The town will never forgive you. The town has already decided not to forgive me, Ma. Sarah gently removed her mother's hand. At least this way, maybe some good will come of being an outcast. She spent the next hour gathering everything she could think of that might help. Willow bark for fever, honey for cough, dried mint for nausea, clean cloths for cooling compresses. Her grandmother's old leather satchel, which had sat unused since the older woman's death 5 years earlier, seemed to welcome the familiar weight of healing supplies. As she prepared to leave, Sarah caught sight of herself in the small mirror above their washstand. She looked the same as always. Auburn hair braided back, green eyes serious with concentration, freckles scattered across her nose from too much sun. But she felt different, as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff about to step into empty air. Be careful, darling, Colleen whispered, embracing her daughter tightly. Come back to me. I will, Ma. I promise. But as Sarah walked toward Willow Creek, her grandmother's satchel heavy in her hands, she couldn't shake the feeling that the woman who came back might not be quite the same person who was leaving. Chapter 3. Into the Unknown. The ride to the Comanche camp took nearly 2 hours, following game trails and creek beds that Running Bear navigated with the easy confidence of someone who had traveled these paths his entire life. Sarah rode behind him on his paint horse, acutely aware of how exposed they were on the open prairie, and how completely she had placed her life in the hands of a man she barely knew. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when they crested a low hill, and Sarah saw the camp spread out in the valley below. It was smaller than she had expected, perhaps 30 lodges arranged in a rough circle near a bend in the creek. Smoke rose from several fires, and she could see people moving about their daily tasks. Children played near the water's edge, while women worked at various tasks around the lodges. But as they rode down into the camp, Sarah noticed the activity gradually cease. One by one, faces turned toward them, and she felt the weight of dozens of stares. Some showed curiosity, others suspicion, and more than a few displayed open hostility. "Stay close to me," Running Bear murmured without turning around. "Do not meet anyone's eyes directly unless I tell you to do so." They rode through the camp toward a lodge that was larger than most of the others, decorated with painted symbols that Sarah didn't recognize. An elderly woman emerged from the lodge as they approached. Her weathered face creased with worry lines that seemed carved by years of hardship. "Grandmother," Running Bear said, dismounting and helping Sarah down from the horse. "This is the white woman I spoke of. She has come to help Little Wolf." The elderly woman, Running Bear's mother-in-law, Sarah realized, looked her up and down with sharp, assessing eyes. When she spoke, it was in rapid Comanche that Sarah couldn't understand, but the tone was clearly questioning, perhaps even challenging. Running Bear replied in the same language, his voice respectful but firm. The conversation continued for several minutes, while Sarah stood awkwardly, aware that other members of the tribe were gathering at a respectful distance, watching this unusual scene unfold. Finally, the elderly woman nodded curtly and gestured toward the lodge entrance. "She says you may enter," Running Bear translated, "but she warns that if you bring harm to the boy, intended or not, she will personally ensure you do not leave this camp alive." Sarah swallowed hard, but nodded. "I understand." The interior of the lodge was dim and warm, lit by a small fire in the center and filled with the scent of burning sage. It took Sarah's eyes a moment to adjust, but when they did, she saw a small figure lying on a bed of buffalo robes near the far wall. Little Wolf was indeed small for his 11 years, his body racked by illness. His skin was flushed with fever, and Sarah could hear the labored wheeze of his breathing from across the lodge. Dark hair, damp with sweat, clung to his skull, and even in sleep his face was contorted with discomfort. Sarah knelt beside the boy and gently placed her hand on his forehead. He was burning up. The fever was dangerously high. When she lifted his eyelids to check his pupils, she saw that his eyes were glassy and unfocused. "How long has he been this way?" she asked quietly. 4 days since the fever began," Running Bear replied, crouching on the other side of his son. 2 days since he stopped eating. Yesterday he could not keep water down." Sarah opened her satchel and began laying out her supplies. The first priority was bringing down the fever before it caused permanent damage. She mixed willow bark powder with a small amount of water, creating a bitter paste. "I need to get this into him," she said. "It will help with the fever, but it tastes terrible. Can you help me hold him up?" Together they managed to get most of the medicine into Little Wolf, though he fought them weakly and most of it seemed to come back up immediately. Sarah wasn't discouraged. She had expected this. "We need to cool him down," she said, reaching for the clean cloths she had brought. "I need water, cool, but not cold." The elderly woman, who had been watching silently from near the fire, spoke sharply to someone outside the lodge. Within minutes, a young woman appeared with a wooden bowl of water from the creek. Sarah began the painstaking process of bathing Little Wolf with cool cloths, working systematically to bring his body temperature down. As she worked, she became aware that Running Bear was speaking to his son in Comanche, his voice low and soothing. "What are you telling him?" she asked softly. "I tell him that help has come," Running Bear replied, never taking his eyes off his son's face. "I tell him that a brave white woman has risked much to bring him medicine. I tell him that his mother watches over him and that he must fight to live." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the raw love in the man's voice. This was simply a father, desperate to save his child, no different from any parent she had ever known. For the next several hours, Sarah worked tirelessly. She managed to get small amounts of honey-sweetened water into Little Wolf, easing his throat and providing some nutrition. She prepared poultices for his chest to help with the congestion, and she continued the cooling baths whenever his fever spiked. Gradually, she became aware that others had entered the lodge. She looked up to see several tribal members watching her work, some with curiosity, others with what looked like grudging respect. An elderly man with intricate tattoos covering his arms sat near the fire, observing everything with intelligent eyes. "That is Wise Elk," Running Bear explained quietly. He is our medicine man. He has done all he knows to do for Little Wolf." Sarah looked toward the medicine man and inclined her head respectfully. To her surprise, he spoke to her in accented English. "You know the plant medicine," he said. It wasn't a question. "My grandmother taught me," Sarah replied. "She learned from her grandmother, who learned from hers." Wise Elk nodded slowly. "The old knowledge. It is good." He paused, studying her face. "But why do you risk yourself for a child of our people?" It was the same question Running Bear had asked, and Sarah found herself giving the same answer. Because it's right. But Wise Elk wasn't satisfied with that simple response. "Your people kill our children," he said bluntly. "They drive us from our lands, poison our waterholes, slaughter our buffalo. Why should one white woman care if one Comanche boy lives or dies?" Sarah stopped her work and looked directly at the medicine man. "Because one child's life shouldn't depend on the color of his skin or the actions of people he had no part in choosing. Because someone has to break the cycle of hatred, or it will destroy all of us." Wise Elk considered this for a long moment, then nodded. "You speak wisdom for one so young." As the night wore on, Sarah began to see small signs of improvement. Little Wolf's fever broke around midnight, leaving him drenched in sweat but breathing more easily. He was able to keep down larger amounts of water, and his color began to improve. "He's not out of danger yet," Sarah warned Running Bear as dawn approached. "The fever could return, and he's very weak. He'll need careful nursing for at least another week." "Will you stay?" Running Bear asked quietly. Sarah looked around the lodge at the faces surrounding her, people who just yesterday had been her enemies, but who now looked at her with something approaching acceptance. She thought of her mother, alone and worried back at their cabin. She thought of the town of Cedar Ridge, where her absence would certainly be noted and probably investigated. "I need to go home," she said finally, "but I'll come back tomorrow if you need me to. And I'll leave medicines and instructions for his care." As she prepared to leave, the elderly woman, Running Bear's mother-in-law, approached her. She spoke rapidly in Comanche, pressing something into Sarah's hands. "She says to tell you that you are welcome in this lodge," Running Bear translated. "She gives you this as a token of our family's gratitude." Sarah looked down at the object in her hands, a small beaded pouch, intricately worked in blues and whites. It was beautiful, and she could tell from the craftsmanship that it had taken many hours to make. "Tell her I'm honored," Sarah said, clutching the pouch tightly, "and tell her that Little Wolf is a strong boy. With proper care, he should recover fully." As Running Bear prepared to escort her home, Sarah took one last look at the sleeping child. His breathing was easier now, his color better. It wasn't a miracle. It was just medicine, knowledge passed down through generations of healers. But in this moment, in this place, it felt like something more profound. She had crossed a line tonight, stepped over a boundary that her community had drawn in blood and hatred. There would be consequences, she was certain of that. But as she looked at Little Wolf's peaceful face, she knew she would make the same choice again. Chapter 4. The Price of Compassion. Sarah returned to her family's cabin as the sun was rising, exhausted but cautiously optimistic about Little Wolf's condition. She had expected to find her mother waiting anxiously for her return, but she hadn't expected to find Sheriff Dalton's horse tied to their fence post. Her heart sank as she approached the cabin and heard raised voices from inside. Through the thin walls, she could make out Dalton's gravelly voice and her mother's higher, more strained tones. Sarah paused at the door, gathering her courage before pushing it open. "Telling you, Mrs. McKenna, that daughter of yours has gone too far this time," Sheriff Dalton was saying, his bulky frame dominating their small main room. His deputy, a nervous young man named Pete Collins, stood near the door, fidgeting with his hat. "Sheriff Dalton," Sarah said quietly, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "What brings you to our home so early?" Dalton turned toward her, his cold grey eyes taking in her dusty clothes and the leather satchel still in her hand. "Miss McKenna, out for an early morning walk, were you?" "I was checking on a sick animal," Sarah replied, setting her satchel down carefully and meeting his stare. It wasn't entirely a lie. Little Wolf had certainly been sick. "Is that so?" Dalton stepped closer and Sarah caught the smell of whiskey on his breath despite the early hour. "Funny thing, though. Tom Hartley saw a Comanche brave riding through town yesterday afternoon, bold as brass. And then this morning, old Pete here comes to tell me he spotted smoke from what looked like a Comanche camp about 10 miles northeast of here." Sarah felt her mother's fearful gaze on her, but kept her expression neutral. I wouldn't know anything about that, Sheriff. Wouldn't you? Dalton's smile was unpleasant. See, the thing is, Miss McKenna, ever since you started stirring up trouble about how we handle the Indian situation, we've had nothing but problems. Cattle missing, property damaged, and now they're camping practically on our doorstep. Maybe they're camping there because you've driven them off their traditional hunting grounds, Sarah said before she could stop herself. The words hung in the air, like a challenge. Deputy Collins shifted uncomfortably, and Sarah's mother made a small, distressed sound. Dalton's face darkened. There it is, he said softly. That's exactly the kind of talk that's been poisoning this community. You've got sympathy for murdering savages, but no loyalty to your own people. My loyalty is to what's right, Sarah replied, though her voice trembled slightly. And brutality is wrong, no matter who it's directed toward. Dalton moved closer, close enough that Sarah had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. Let me make something very clear to you, Miss McKenna. This community has been patient with you because of respect for your late father, but that patience has limits. He turned to address Colleen directly. Mrs. McKenna, I'm going to give you some friendly advice. Keep your daughter close to home for the next few days. There are rumors circulating about her activities, and some of the townspeople are getting concerned. What kind of rumors? Colleen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The kind that suggest she might be providing aid and comfort to the enemy, Dalton replied bluntly. The kind that make people wonder if she can be trusted to put the safety of white settlers above her misguided sympathies. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had known there would be consequences for helping Little Wolf, but she was beginning to understand that those consequences might be more severe than she had imagined. Are you threatening my daughter, Sheriff? Colleen asked, finding her voice. I'm trying to protect her, Dalton replied, but I can only do so much if she keeps making choices that put her at odds with this community's survival. After the sheriff and his deputy left, Sarah and her mother sat in tense silence for several minutes. Finally, Colleen spoke. Tell me the truth, Sarah. Where were you last night? Sarah looked at her mother's worried face and made a decision. I was helping a sick child. A Comanche child. Yes. Colleen closed her eyes and rubbed her temples. Oh, Sarah, what have you done? I saved a little boy's life, Sarah said quietly. Or at least, I hope I did. And possibly signed your own death warrant in the process, her mother replied sharply. Do you understand what Dalton was really saying? He was warning us that there are people in town who would hurt you and that he might not be able to stop them. Sarah had understood exactly what Dalton was saying, but hearing her mother spell it out made it feel more real, more frightening. Still, when she thought of Little Wolf's fevered face, she couldn't bring herself to regret her actions. I have to go back, she said. Today. The boy isn't out of danger yet. Sarah, no. Colleen grabbed her daughter's hands. You heard what the sheriff said. You need to stay away from that camp. Ma, if I don't go back, that child might die. His fever could return or complications could set in. I'm the only one who knows how to treat him properly. And if you do go back, you might not come home at all, Colleen replied desperately. Either because something happens to you at the camp, or because the townspeople decide you're a traitor who needs to be dealt with. Sarah pulled her hands free and walked to the small window that looked out over their struggling farm. In the distance, she could see the road that led to town, and she found herself wondering how many of their neighbors would stand by and watch if a mob came for her. What would grandmother have done? She asked quietly. Colleen was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with resignation. She would have gone back. Then you understand why I have to. Understanding and approving are two different things, Colleen said. But I also understand that I raised you to have a conscience, and I can't ask you to abandon it now. That afternoon, Sarah made her second journey to the Comanche camp, this time on foot and taking a much more circuitous route to avoid being seen. She carried fresh supplies and a growing sense of unease about what she might find when she returned to town. Little Wolf was indeed better, sitting up and taking small amounts of food, his fever gone and his breathing much improved. The relief in Running Bear's eyes when he saw her approach was unmistakable. You came back, he said simply. I said I would. As she examined Little Wolf and adjusted his treatment, Sarah became aware of a commotion outside the lodge. Raised voices, the sound of horses, an air of tension that made her stomach clench with apprehension. Running Bear stepped outside to investigate, returning a few minutes later with a grim expression. What is it? Sarah asked. Scouts have returned from town, he said quietly. They report that armed men are gathering. There is talk of retaliation. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Retaliation for what? For harboring enemies of the white man, Running Bear replied. It seems your visit here has not gone unnoticed. Sarah sank down beside Little Wolf's bed, the full weight of her situation finally hitting her. She had tried to save one child's life, and in doing so, she might have endangered everyone she cared about, her mother, the members of this camp, even Little Wolf himself. I have to go, she said, starting to gather her supplies. If I'm not here, maybe— No, Running Bear interrupted firmly. If you leave now alone and they find you on the prairie, you will not survive the night, and your leaving will not stop what is coming. Sarah looked up at him, seeing her own fear reflected in his dark eyes. What are you saying? I am saying that choices have consequences, Running Bear replied gravely, and sometimes those consequences affect more people than just the one who made the choice. We must all decide now what we are willing to fight for. Outside the lodge, Sarah could hear the sounds of the camp preparing for something. Weapons being readied, horses being saddled, children being moved to safer locations. Her simple act of compassion had set in motion events that none of them could now control. As night fell over the Comanche camp, Sarah found herself sitting beside a recovering child, while two communities prepared for a confrontation that would test everything she believed about right and wrong, about the price of standing up for one's principles, and about whether love could truly triumph over hatred. The final test was coming, and Sarah wasn't sure any of them would survive it. Chapter 5. The Bridge Between Worlds. The attack came at dawn, just as Sarah was checking Little Wolf's temperature and finding it blessedly normal for the first time in days. The thunder of hoofbeats and angry shouts shattered the peaceful morning, sending panic through the camp like wildfire. Running Bear burst into the lodge, his face grim. They come in force, he said, gathering his weapons. Perhaps 20 men, maybe more. They fly no flag, wear no badges. This is not an official action. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized what this meant. Sheriff Dalton had either lost control of the situation or chosen to look the other way, while a vigilante mob took matters into their own hands. Either way, she was responsible for bringing this violence to these people's doorstep. Take Little Wolf and run, she said urgently, helping the boy sit up. He was weak but alert, his eyes wide with fear as the sounds of approaching violence grew louder. Get him away from here. There is nowhere to run, Running Bear replied, checking his rifle. They have us surrounded, and I will not abandon my people to face this alone. Outside, Sarah could hear Wise Elk's voice calling out commands in Comanche, the sound of women gathering children, men taking defensive positions. This peaceful camp was transforming into a battlefield, and it was all because of her. This is my fault, Sarah said, her voice breaking. I have to try to stop this. Running Bear grabbed her arm as she moved toward the lodge entrance. You will be killed the moment you show your face. They did not come here to talk. Then I'll die trying to prevent a massacre, Sarah replied, gently pulling free. But I won't hide in here while people die because of my choices. She pushed aside the lodge flap and stepped outside into chaos. Warriors were taking cover behind lodges and trees, their weapons trained on the approaching riders. Women were herding children toward the creek, seeking what little protection the bank might offer. In the distance, Sarah could see the mob cresting the hill above the camp. Perhaps 25 men, all armed, their faces twisted with rage and bloodlust. At their head rode Tom Hartley, the shopkeeper who had refused to serve her just days earlier. Beside him was Deputy Collins, though Sheriff Dalton was nowhere to be seen. The rest were townspeople she recognized, farmers, ranchers, laborers, all united in their determination to punish what they saw as betrayal. Sarah McKenna! Hartley's voice boomed across the valley as the mob drew closer. We know you're in there. Come out and face what you've brought on these people. Sarah stepped forward, her legs trembling but her voice steady as she called back, I'm here, Tom. Let's talk about this. Talk? Hartley laughed bitterly, raising his rifle. Time for talking is over. You chose your side, girl. Now you can die with your savage friends. The first shot rang out before Sarah could respond, though she couldn't tell who had fired it. Within seconds, the valley erupted in gunfire as both sides opened up. Sarah threw herself behind a pile of firewood as bullets whined overhead, her mind racing desperately for some way to stop the violence. The battle was brutally one-sided. The townspeople had the advantage of numbers and position, firing down into the camp from the hillside. Several Comanche warriors had already fallen, and Sarah could hear the screams of wounded and terrified children mixing with the crack of gunfire. It was then that she heard the new sound, more hoofbeats approaching fast from the east. For a moment her heart sank, thinking reinforcements had arrived for the mob. But as the new riders crested the opposite hill, Sarah saw something that made her gasp in disbelief. Sheriff Dalton rode at the head of a column of cavalry soldiers, their blue uniforms stark against the morning sky. Behind them came an unlikely group, her mother driving their old wagon, and beside her incredibly Reverend Walsh and several other townspeople Sarah recognized. The arrival of the soldiers caused the gunfire to sputter and die, as both sides tried to understand this new development. Dalton rode directly between the two groups, his voice carrying clearly across the valley. "By order of the territorial government, I command all parties to lay down their weapons immediately," he shouted. "Any man who continues firing will be arrested for disturbing the peace." Hartley lowered his rifle, confusion clear on his face. "Sheriff, what are you doing? These people are harboring a traitor." "These people," Dalton replied coldly, "are under federal protection until their legal status can be determined. And Miss McKenna is a civilian who has committed no crime under territorial law." Sarah stared at the sheriff in shock. This was the same man who had threatened her just yesterday, who had beaten prisoners and shown nothing but contempt for Native Americans. What had changed? As if hearing her thoughts, Dalton turned toward the camp and called out, "Miss McKenna, are you harmed?" Sarah stood up slowly, still not quite believing what she was seeing. "I'm unharmed, Sheriff." "Good. You need to come with me now. There are some people who want to speak with you." As Sarah made her way across the battlefield, stepping carefully around wounded men from both sides, she saw her mother climbing down from the wagon. Colleen ran to her daughter, pulling her into a fierce embrace. "Thank God you're alive," her mother whispered. "When we heard the shooting—" "Ma, what are you doing here?" Sarah asked, bewildered. "How did you know?" "Your mother came to me," Reverend Walsh said, approaching them with a solemn expression. "She told me what you had done, how you risked your life to save a sick child. She helped me understand that we had all lost sight of our Christian duty." The Reverend looked around the camp, taking in the wounded, the frightened children, the devastation that hatred had wrought. "I went to Sheriff Dalton and told him that if we allow vigilante justice to rule our community, we are no better than the very savagery we claim to oppose." Dalton himself rode over, dismounting near the small group. "Miss McKenna," he said formally, "I owe you an apology and an explanation." Sarah stared at him, still struggling to process this transformation. "I don't understand." "Last night after I left your farm, I did some thinking," Dalton said, his voice heavy. "I realized that my anger at you wasn't really about your actions. It was about my own shame at the kind of man I've become. When Reverend Walsh came to me this morning and told me what was happening, I knew I had to choose what kind of lawman I wanted to be." He gestured toward the camp, where Comanche women were tending to wounded warriors, while children peered out from behind lodges. "A boy's life was saved because you chose compassion over fear. I've seen enough death and hatred to know that's not something to be punished." The next several hours passed in a blur of activity. The wounded from both sides were treated, with Sarah working alongside Wise Elk to tend injuries regardless of whether they belonged to white men or Comanche warriors. The dead were gathered and prepared for burial according to their respective customs, and slowly, carefully, a fragile peace began to take shape. Tom Hartley, his face gray with shock at what his actions had nearly caused, approached Sarah as she finished bandaging a young warrior's arm. "Sarah," he said quietly, his voice thick with shame. I don't know how to apologize for what I nearly did." Sarah looked up at him, seeing not the angry mob leader but the man who'd given her peppermint sticks as a child. "You were afraid, Tom. We all were. Fear makes people do terrible things. But you weren't afraid," he said. "Or if you were, you didn't let it stop you from doing what was right." "I was terrified," Sarah admitted, "but I had to try. That little boy didn't deserve to suffer because adults couldn't see past their prejudices." As the sun began to set, Sarah found herself sitting beside little Wolf's bed once more. The boy was much improved, sitting up and even managing to smile when she checked his pulse. Running Bear sat across from them, his weathered face thoughtful. "What happens now?" Sarah asked quietly. "Now we try to build something better," Running Bear replied. "Sheriff Dalton has proposed a formal treaty. a way for our peoples to coexist without the constant threat of violence. It will not be easy, and there will be those on both sides who resist it. Sarah nodded, understanding the challenges that lay ahead. But it's a start. Yes, Running Bear agreed. Thanks to you, it is a start. As Sarah prepared to return home with her mother, Little Wolf grabbed her hand with surprising strength for a boy who had been near death just days before. Thank you, he said in careful English, the words clearly practiced. You saved my life. Sarah squeezed his small hand gently. You're going to grow up to be a bridge between our worlds, she told him. I can see it in your eyes. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the main street of Cedar Ridge, watching as Running Bear and several other Comanche leaders met with Sheriff Dalton and the town council to discuss trade agreements and territorial boundaries. The sight would have been unthinkable just a short time ago, but the events of that violent dawn had changed something fundamental in both communities. It wasn't perfect. There were still those who harbored resentment and suspicion on both sides, but it was progress, built on the foundation of one young woman's refusal to let fear overcome compassion. Sarah smiled as she saw Little Wolf running with other children near the creek, his laughter carrying on the wind. He was healthy and strong now, a living reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of courage could change the world. Her grandmother would have been proud.